this panel that I appreciate very much. I want to talk about the German Verkehrswende and the mobility justice related issues. And I want to focus on 4 aspects.
Okay, Tobias, before you will continue, just two points for the procedure. The first point is that we have this slot of 2 hours, and so we present 4 contributions, and of course you can discuss and you comment these contributions, and please type in the right side. On the right side you have this type your message button, and there you can, during the presentation, already type on your questions or comments, and after on. So we have 20 minutes contribution time and 8 to 10 minute discussion time. Okay, please continue, Tobias.
Okay. All right, thank you. And the structure of my presentation is the following. First, I want to say a few words about the concept of mobility justice. Then I will go on outlining a few ideas on the political economy of mobility injustice. And then I want to focus on 4 dimensions of mobility justice within the German Verkehrswende, which is actually not much more than an Antriebswende so far, and change of the drivetrain of cars as a focus. And I will end with a conclusion. The concept of mobility justice has come up within the last decade, and one proponent who was very important in the debate on mobility justice is Mimi Scheller. She defined mobility justice as an overarching concept for thinking about how power and inequality inform the governance and control of movement, shaping the patterns of unequal mobility and immobility in the circulation of people, resources, and information. So the concept has a quite broad perspective. She also wrote a monography on mobility justice that was published, I think, in 2019 at VESU. And the background of the concept is, from my perspective, largely in political theory and social movement studies, and also in mobility studies. However, while there's a kind of growing momentum for the concept of mobility justice within the academic realm, in the struggles over the transition and transportation, it's a quite marginalized concept. That's at least my impression. That is also based on more than 20 expert interviews that I did within a research project at FU Berlin with different stakeholders. And I want to outline some ideas how the concept of mobility justice can be brought into articulation with political economy approaches. The current status quo is characterized by a lot of inequalities and moments of injustice. Capitalist economy is based on the focus on growth and steady acceleration. Value chains, the means of production have been further and further globalized, and this was only possible due to growing infrastructure for transportation, as well as growing volumes of transportation of goods as well as of people. And this steady growth in transportation, that is one serious cause of climate warming, has been fueled by fossil fuels. And this system of steady growth is linked to various forms of inequalities that are based or that are articulated in a national context as well as in international context. And these inequalities are related strongly to the sphere of mobility. And regarding the case of Germany, it's important to have in mind that there are a lot of vested interests associated with the current mobility and transportation system, and the importance of the automotive industry is very high. And as several studies already indicated that there's a lot of talk about the Verkehrs or sometimes the Mobilitätswende, but actually what is happening in the political realm is not more than an Antriebswende, an exchange of the drivetrain of the car from internal combustion engine to battery electric vehicles by subsidies like the Kaufprämie or public money for new charging infrastructure and several other measures. And my argument is that these political measures kind of implicitly pick up aspects of mobility justice, but only implicitly and only partially. And I want to outline 4 dimensions, knowing that there are a lot more dimensions I could focus on, like gender justice or racial justice, and so on. The first dimension that I want to briefly sketch is the issue of climate justice. I already indicated that the transport sector is one of the main causes of global warming, and in Germany about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the sector. And this is becoming increasingly addressed. There's, for example, a climate target for 2030 within Germany that says that the transport sector has to reduce its carbon emissions by 40 to 42%. And the main approach to succeed with this aim is to subsidize electric vehicles because they are zero carbon vehicles, at least in the balance of the transportation sector. And this indicates that there's a kind of picking up climate justice concerns. However, the flip side of the electric vehicles is that they tend, or at least there's a danger that resource injustices are excavated by this, as electric vehicles need, at least in the production process, more resources than cars with internal combustion engines. And there are already right now a lot of conflicts regarding social and ecological aspects with resource extractivism in the global south. And if there's a higher demand for rare earth, lithium or cobalt, these conflicts could intensify. And against this background, there's a kind of ambivalent balance of electric vehicles because they help to address the climate injustices, and they at the same time tend to sharpen resources injustices. And then I come to the third dimension. This is related to labor. The concept of just transition was developed within labor unions. And the public debate about the Verkehrswende in Germany is highly dominated by the fear for job losses in the automotive industry, with more than 800,000 employees these days. And most of them are organized by IG Metall, the biggest single labor union in the world. And labor conditions are quite well, at least for the core labor. within the big automotive companies and suppliers as well. And they mobilized a lot against electric vehicles and all forms of Verkehrswende. However, this has changed in the last few months and years as well. There are now a lot of plans to establish plans to produce battery cells. Tesla announced or is already building a new plant near Berlin in Grünheide. And so there's a potential to renew the employment potential. And that's why you can draw the conclusion that there's kind of picking up, selective picking up of just transition aspects, in the sense that employment needs to be renewed. Also, although there's a change in the transportation mode with the Antriebswende. However, this is also mostly focused on the national context. There's not a large debate about global inequalities and so on, although there's Lieferkettengesetz. The debate is mostly on labor within Germany. The first dimension I want to briefly outline is what is often called transportation justice, which means the burdens and benefits of the current transportation system. One positive aspect of electric vehicles is without any doubt that within cities the air quality will improve with the further penetration of electric vehicles. However, just promoting electric vehicles does not better the situation for people who are already poor in mobility options, who don't have access to mobility. And insofar, there's only a partial bettering for the situation of marginalized people. And also there's a threat of eco-gentrification if air quality is improving. And so one can draw the conclusion that the burden and benefits remain very unequal within the context of the Antriebswende. And so I already come to the conclusion of my presentation. The Antriebswende contributes only partially to climate justice and just transition related concerns. And it even might heightens resource injustice and inequalities related to benefits and burdens of transportation, of the current transportation system. And this indicates that there's need for much more than an Antriebswende. However, within the current constellation of forces, it is not possible to push, or it's at least not yet possible to push really further than an Antriebswende. And this indicates that mobility justice can only become reality if the current conditions of constituting power and inequality become transformed. So my argument is that the changes have to be really profound to fulfill the vision and ideas of the concept of mobility justice, the normative content of it. And here are three publications that kind of informed my input, one from by myself and mobilities. Jason Henderson wrote an article lately about arguing that electric vehicles are not the answer for mobility justice, and Mimi Scheller's monography, Mobility Justice, the Politics of Movement in an Age of Extremes. All right, thank you very much, and I'm very curious on your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Tobias. So there's enough time left for questions and comments. And yes, I see the first question. On the subject of resource justice, would you say the extremist injustices of conflict minerals are worse than the injustice around fossil fuel extradition for fossil fuel mobility? So, yes.
Okay, that's a good question. Thank you very much. It's a difficult question. I think without any doubt, the dependence on fossil fuel, especially oil, is very problematic, and there were a lot of conflicts and wars also over the control of oil. And indeed, I think it's a fair point to say that with the push for electric vehicles, the dependence on oil will be reduced. And in that sense, electric vehicles are an improvement of this problem. However, there are a lot of new problems generated with electric vehicles. But to really balance these two aspects is probably a quite challenging task.
Okay, more questions? So I have a question, Tobias, regarding your what you mentioned about the role or the politics of the IG Metall. You called it the biggest union in the world in this field. IG Metall fighted against the Verkehrswende and especially against electric vehicles over years, and you say they switched their position. Do you think that they really switched, or is it more a tactical move? What do you think? Is the IG Metall nowadays more a part of the problem or a part of the solution?
Yeah, one interview partner said that IG Metall has two phases. The official phase is that they're in favor of the Verkehrswende and innovations and so on. And when it comes to political decision, IG Metall lobbies for the internal combustion engine and all the employment conditions that are associated with it. However, I think that there has been also a shift within the automotive industry. There was a conflict between Ben Hattis, the CEO of Volkswagen, and VDA, the Association of German Automotive Industry. And these attacked VDA for being technology open. And he said, well, that's a strategy to keep the status quo. And this made the point to say we have to go in the direction of electric vehicles. There's no alternative to that. And I'm not very much familiar with the debate within IG Metall in the very recent time, but that's at least the impression that I had, that IG Metall also went step by step to the direction of electric vehicles. And if even the CEO of Volkswagen really pushes in this direction, I assume that IG Metall also goes in this direction. And there also, I didn't mention this, the climate regulation on the European level also kind of forces each OEM to go strongly in the direction of battery electric vehicles. So I think that the resistance of IG Metall against electric vehicles decreased also in recent times.
Okay, we will see. There's another question from Gracia. She asked more or less very fundamental, why would you say everyone has to have access to all modes of transport? That's what you mentioned at the end of your presentation, that everybody has to have access to all modes.
Okay, no, I wouldn't go so far. I mean, if everybody would have access to all modes of transportation, then probably the climate crisis would further escalate. I think it's right now it's mostly based on financial resources, who has access to which kind of transportation, and in a very unequal society, the access to mobility service is also very unequal. And as far as I understand the concept of mobility justice, it says that this should be a democratic question, and principally everybody should have the same access, but the access possibilities shouldn't limit people in other areas of the world or future generations, because if everybody flies all the time around the world, the climate crisis will escalate, and fossil fuels are also limited. So there's a tension between accessibility inaccessibility on the one hand side, and the limitedness of the world. And for that reason, I think it should be equal, but equal within nations and also within generations.
There's another question regarding to this point, and I understand the question of Niels, that he thinks that this argument of accessibility is quite not invisible in the discourse, at least in the discourse. What do you think?
Of accessibility is not in the discourse. Yeah, I really agree. It's very, very marginalized. Also the Sozialverbände, the social unions, they are not here in the public debate. And also, I think within academia, it has been also marginalized. So far, there are some studies on environmental justice and so on. But I think this is also something where academia can contribute to highlight this aspect further in the debate on mobility. I think this is something we have to bring forward, and that's why I also appreciate this panel here.
Okay, and Julia asked, how would you consider the impact of the recent protests in the Dannröder Forst, that means the protest against the motorway, on debates around mobility justice within policymaker circles?
Mm-hmm. Well, I highly appreciate the protests in Dannröder Wald. They are not labeled under the. They're not labeled as a struggle for mobility justice, but I think implicitly they address a lot of aspects. And within Germany, there are 850 kilometers of new motorways, Autobahn, planned until 2030. So there's a lot of there's a strong push for new motorways, and the protests against them are increasing, not only in Dannröder Wald, also in Halle, Berlin, and other places. So I think this will be a point of struggle in the future, and I think it would be really good if a lot of these planned 850 kilometers wouldn't be built, because history tells us that if there are new roads, then there will be the traffic coming, cars and lorries driving on the motorways. So I think these are important struggles for mobility justice as well, because they the new motorways destroy nature in several ways.
Okay, maybe you see in the comments that there's a greeting from Miranda. Miranda is, as well as Jörg and me, organizer of this session, but she is still in a Fulbright-Auswahl commission. But there's one question left about the concept of justice. There are a lot of concepts of justice, and which concept is particularly useful when it comes down to your field position?
Yeah, that's important question. I'm more from a political economy field than from political theory, and in the edited volume on mobility justice from, I think, 2019, in the introductory section, there are something like 10 aspects of mobility justice mentioned. I think there's no one size fits all approach. I think it depends on your research interest, and against this background, you have to operationalize the concept of mobility justice and to think about which aspects of mobility justice are important for your own work. Regarding the presentation I held, I find it interesting to have two that address the international dimension, and two more the national dimension. But I think there are a lot of different possibilities to operationalize the concept of mobility justice.
Okay, and Henrike Rau asks, to what extent should immobility be part of the mobility justice debate, especially if you see what happened during the Corona crisis and the homework and the avoid of work-related mobility?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting aspect. Katharina Manderscheid and I think Noé Kass once wrote about the right of not to move. I think, I indicated in my part on the political economy of injustice and inequalities that the richer part of the population is also much more mobile, but often mobility is also kind of force and not only something that is admirable. I think it's an important point, and it hints to the aspect and the question what a good life also means. And I have sympathies for the degrowth ideas and in the German word is Entschleunigung. So I think it's important to think also in that direction, and I would say that the right of not to move or being immobile should be also an important aspect of mobility justice.
Yeah, I think it's the same. This question of Klaus Leibniz is going to the same direction. He asks, it is not much too short looking to address mobility justice mainly by a transportation access perspective. Yeah, I think I showed that it's a very broad perspective, mobility justice, and the access to transportation is important. Without any doubt, and as Niels already mentioned, it's quite marginalized in the public debate. That's why I think it's important to consider and to think about the access to transportation. There has been also a lot of work on that, but more in the US context, because large
or a relevant part of the society really struggles to have access to mobility services. And the prices, for example, in public transport increased within the last 20 years much more than the cost for a private car, for example. So it's a serious issue, but the concept is much broader.
Okay, and last question is from Niels again. He is discussing the relationship between this topic of accessibility and the defenders of the old technique in this struggle over the Antriebswende. He asks, is the accessibility dimension one which is in fact brought up by the defenders of an Antriebswende?
Is it brought up? No, I don't think that they really bring this aspect up because accessibility won't be improved with the Antriebswende. What the proponents of the Antriebswende bring up more is the improvement of air quality and so on. And if we think a bit broader, it's also the issue if shared mobilities or other new services, if they could improve the accessibility to transportation services. I think this is another huge aspect, and some argue that, for example, I think you read as well, that the new services could also improve the accessibility, but this is a broader or another approach than just focusing on the Antriebswende.
Okay, thank you very much. It's time to give over to Jörg Radke. Jörg, do you hear me? You can come in to the session? I don't see you. Yeah.
So now you can see and hear me, I hope.
Okay, so will you please continue? And Johanna Hornung is the next contributor.
Yes, thank you very much, Wert, for this moderation so far. And I'm now looking forward to the presentation by Jasmin Richlik, Nils Bandelow, and Johanna Hornung from the Technical University of Braunschweig. The title of this presentation is Policy, Core Beliefs and Social Identities Driving Sustainable Transport Policy. It is maybe, again, an actor-centered approach, asking more fundamentally what drives actors in promoting sustainable transport policy. So I'm very much looking forward to this presentation now and your exciting insights into this research field, as well as your results, especially since I'm personally a fan of the Advocacy Coalition framework. So please feel free to start your presentation now.
Yes, thank you very much for the great introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm presenting a paper, or rather a project, which is funded by the BMBF and was conducted in collaboration with the University of Frankfurt and Braunschweig, and concerns the urban planning, or the study and analysis of urban planning and infrastructure policy in Frankfurt and Darmstadt. And this presentation is a joint result of the research surrounding this project. And as you can see, Jasmin Richlik and Nils Bandelow also contributed a lot to what I will present now. What we have investigated during this project is basically what drives a sustainable transport policy in municipal areas, and how can we explain that transport is becoming more sustainable in these areas, which leads us directly to our starting point and challenge. So we have the obvious challenge on how to achieve sustainable municipal transport, especially in a city like Frankfurt, which is a metropolis with a lot of car traffic and a lot of people that are very mobile, at least before the Corona times, it was the case. And we also have different actors with different interests regarding modes of transport. So we have some conflicts here that arise from the different perspectives of the actors. So our research question centered around what drives actors actually in promoting sustainable transport policy. So how can we achieve sustainable transport policy, and how what are the driving factors of their cooperation, so to speak? How do they cooperate? Why do they cooperate? And how can this actually lead to the transformation of the transport sector on a municipal level? And to research this question, we draw on several theoretical perspectives and explanations that look at the collaboration and preference formation of actors. As Jörg Radke already said, we have one focus on the advocacy coalition framework that assumes that actors collaborate on the basis of shared beliefs, policy core beliefs, and deep normative core beliefs. So these present the basis for cooperation. But we also analyzed another perspective in this regard, and that might explain actor preferences and collaboration, and this is a view on social identities in the policy process. It's a relatively old perspective in social psychology, but a relatively new perspective in policy process research that we introduced to explain preferences and collaboration of actors over the membership in social groups. And what we mean by social groups is any group that is relevant to the policy process. This might be a political party, but it also might be an organization, an association, or just an informal group of actors that form the social group on the basis of shared biographies, for example, which we translated into a programmatic action framework, but it could also be actors that have commonalities based on the sector they work in. So it might be, for the case of transport policy, for example, that we have that it makes a difference for actors whether they feel belonging to the environmental sector or whether they feel belonging to the economic policy sector. And we are interested in how these social group memberships influence the preferences and collaboration of actors. Also considering the fact that research shows that shared beliefs may actually be the result of social group membership rather than the predisposition of social group membership. So it might not be the case that actors join parties because they have pre-existent policy preferences, but that parties or social groups more general actually shape beliefs later on. And we tested this empirically. And we also added an operationalization of policy core beliefs, preferences, and storylines, which is another research strand that we integrated here, because the assumption is that social groups do not just form preferences, but they also shape communication, public communication in media and the public discourse. So we can use storylines and the public discourse analysis also to get hold of the actors behind the discourse and also identify coalitions and social groups based on these insights. So this is the research design that we applied to the empirical case, or the operationalization that we applied to the empirical case in Frankfurt, with a view on CO2 reduction and climate neutrality strategies. To embed this empirical case a little into the political debate maybe we have in Germany, or had in Germany. In 1990, the results of an enquete commission and an interministerial working group that agreed on the reduction target of 25% CO2 for West Germany by 2005. This is the global setting within which we are situated. Then we have the state level of Hesse, a climate protection act plan in force since 2015, which says and proposes to reach climate neutrality in Hesse by 2025. And for the case of Frankfurt am Main, which we will look closer at in this presentation, is that we have several attempts to transform transport policy and mobility into a more sustainable, environmentally friendly setting, which is particularly to be achieved by the bicycle traffic concept, which was adopted in 1992, and several institutional changes that followed this concept. Among others, the establishment of a cycling office in the road traffic department in 2006. So we see here a lot of attempts in this metropolis to make transport more sustainable and to transform municipal transport into an environmental friendly modes of transport. And we were wondering how this was able to be achieved, and we researched that with standardized questionnaires and interviews, asking the actors that were relevant or identified relevant during this process, which also included the organizations and parties that I already mentioned, and asked them whether and to what extent belonging to social groups affects the formation of beliefs. So this was one research interest. And then also whether and to what extent shared storylines can be traced to social group membership and advocacy coalitions. And we analyzed these data subsequently with qualitative and quantitative analysis. And we have some interesting results that point to the direction of the expectations that we formulated to begin with. So we have the question, what actually drives similar beliefs and preferences? And we can see that partisanship indeed matters, which is probably not really surprising for a German political setting, that parties matter. But we also see that parties really drive preferences and beliefs about transport policy and sustainable municipal transport. So we have a very important role of political parties in the transformation of transport policy at a municipal level. And we also can see, and this is on the next slide, the storylines according to social identities. So here we have the political parties again, but also the organizations, similar organizations, among which we count the associations and the unions. And we also have the sectoral group memberships, so whether people belonged to the environmental sector, for example. And here we also see that this group membership apparently influences, or at least there are correlations between these group memberships and the preferences and storylines that then were communicated in the discourse. So This brings us to the final conclusion. We looked at the different group memberships, social group memberships, and we saw that shared membership in social groups is related to the policy preferences and core beliefs, and these in turn are related to the storylines communicated in the public discourse. So we see interesting relations here, and we can see that these are also essential in the transformation of the discourse on sustainable transport policy. So this transformation was essentially driven by social groups. This is also visible when looking at, for example, how the public discourse in general transformed during the period under investigation. So we saw that, for example, the main topic of the discourse moved from an economically oriented discourse to an environmentally oriented discourse. And this was, in fact, really driven by the social groups surrounding this discourse. And yes, that's the main conclusion, that to achieve sustainable transport policy also at a municipal level, it might be very fruitful to also create identities and social groups artificially, for example, over commissions, by creating commissions where people join together and develop shared identities, which then translate into policy beliefs, preferences, and later also are communicated, and that this communication then also essentially influences whether sustainable municipal transport is achieved. Thank you very much for the attention, and we are looking forward to questions, comments, and feedback.
Yeah, Johanna, thank you also very much for your very interesting presentation. We have our first questions, but maybe I would start with a very short question. For me, it seems that your main results are in line with the general results from policy research, from policy learning, and as you said, the advocacy coalition frameworks and all these influences of policy change and the policy beliefs and so on. So would you say yes, in assumption we could agree with this? We are all in line with these assumptions in more in theory, or would you say, well, there are some differences, and not everything what is known about policy change and policy narratives and so on, not everything is in line with our results?
Yes, thanks for the question. At first, I would say that the social group perspective follows a slightly different logic. At first, it might seem that the results are indeed similar, so partisanship matters, and also policy learning, advocacy coalitions are identifiable. I would definitely agree with that, but I would also say, at least that's our perspective also, that we have developed a little further during the last research periods, that it also makes it different to which groups people actually feel belonging to. And this is really the novelty of the perspectives, that we don't just ask people, are you a member of a party, or are you, which party would you vote for, but also which is your primary identity when you think of transport policy, or certain questions about preferences on transport policy, what is influencing your opinion on that. And there it might indeed be the case that people are following different social groups or social identities, depending on which identity is salient in a given moment. that's the main assumption, that we only act according to one identity in a given moment. And this might be a partisan identity, but it might also be that someone from a completely different party has similar preferences like someone from a different party, and then they share some other commonality. For example, that they have worked together for a long time in the environmental sector, independent of partisanship, and then they have developed a shared view on problems and solutions. And this is also visible not just in their preferences, but also in the way they communicate and the way they articulate their preferences. So,
yeah, that seems to be very interesting, especially as a good starting point for future research. So thank you very much. And we can now start with the questions. And please feel free to everybody to type it here in the in the chat room. And we have first a double question from Miranda Schröers. And so I will bring it together. The first question is, how do you plan to understand social group boundaries as well as social group orientation? Is this primarily tied to specific organizations, or was it through your surveys? And if the latter, what kind of question did you ask? So this would be the first one. And the second is something like a chicken and egg question. Do individuals join groups because of their normative interests, or are their normative interests shaped by the groups? And can you see this implications through your work?
Yes, I'll start with the first block of questions. Partly I already answered the question, at least on the surveys. So what we really try to ask in surveys is to which social groups people actually feel belonging to, and also ask people when thinking of a certain decision or a preference, which group identity really is salient, or what really influences their behavior on this topic or preferences on this topic. This is of course methodologically a little tricky, because some people might not directly know what we want them to answer. So what is meant by which group identity is salient? So this is sometimes related to a little more explanation that we have to give to the respondents. And regarding the social group boundaries and the social group orientation, we have several types or ideal types, macro identities, I would call them, that we have predefined. So this is at first the organization identity, which can be partisanship, but also an association or a union, or also a kind of religious association. Depending on the topic, this might also be relevant. We have local identities. So in the case of transport policy, for example, this might be a difference between people who rather feel they have a metropolitan identity, or that they have a rather rural attachment. And we have these sectoral identities, which we normally operationalize according to commissions or committees, rather. For example, in the parliament or in the Rat as well, in the city council, which committee or which topic they were regularly involved with, because we think that this has then an influence on their social group orientation. It depends on the identity we look at. If we have organizations, this is more clear-cut. But if we have something like sector, then mostly we look at the committees and the regular work a person is involved with to evaluate whether they are influenced by this type of social group. And then the second question is a really good one that we are asking ourselves a lot too. The chicken and egg question. As I said, there is a lot of research on that. The advocacy coalition framework would say people have beliefs and then they enter advocacy coalitions. But as I also showed on the in the reference list, maybe there's a very interesting article by Dancy and Goren in the American Journal of Political Science, who investigate party identification and preferences, and they come to the conclusion, and they modeled this in fact with a lagged regression. So they had a time component integrated in the regression and looked at whether actually preferences followed the group or the group followed the preferences, and they found that it is rather the group shaping preferences. In reality, I would say it might be a symbiotic relationship, so each other kind of interrelate. But in the social identity perspective, we would really assume that you join groups because of some original interest, maybe, or sometimes just by coincidence, because if you enter parliament and there's only one spot left in the committee on environment, then you take it and then you adopt the perspective of the environmental sector, and this then shapes your preferences and behavior. And this is something that we are really interested in to see how these dynamics are actually working.
So maybe it's a complex.
It's definitely complex,
yeah.
And it's also, but we see some evidence for our thesis in our work that people really changed their minds when entering new social groups, and that preferences are not that as stable as it might be proposed by other perspectives. So this is probably an added value that we have.
Yeah, and maybe then that is a fascinating following question about the value-action gap. So first, there are the values, but we all know that there do not have to follow up the actions, the concrete actions. So this is then really a vibrating question. So we will now come to the next question from Grazia Brückmann, and it's about, is there any chance that the state Hessen can be decarbonized by 2025? I'm just curious if realizing that this is rather soon made, some groups you identified in this research project slowing down because of a feeling of doomed to fail. Yeah, what would you say to?
Well, to be honest, I don't know whether Hessen will be decarbonized by 2025. I would also agree that this is rather soon, but I would also say that the empirical evidence we have seen in the research is that there are at least good strategies. So the strategies that they have with the bicycle concept, for example, and considering the fact that they are trying to put through some regulations that also will make the transport modes more sustainable in the long run. I think there are good attempts, and if not by 2025, then I think at least the Corona crisis also offers great opportunities for home office, and it might not be by 2025, but there are already good strategies in place, I would say.
Yeah, so I think maybe it is also the question to put it into the future, as we see in climate change policies, that we can say, well, in 2025, and then we say, well, in 2050, and so on. The next question would be from Martin Herzig, and he would like to know, did you observe changes in the group compositions, the different coalitions? Does the growing salience of sustainability issues might feed the environmental coalition in terms of size and power?
Yes, I would definitely say that we saw changes in group compositions. This is partly visible here on the starting slide in the little network. It's a little small, but the network graphs that we created also compared discourses, for example, at 2 points in time. The first before the bicycle concept was adopted, and the second point in time was after. And we actually saw that the discourse, which was at first more pluralized, then really harmonized around an environmental friendly discourse. And in this discourse, there were also actors that were previously rather arguing in an economic way, or putting more emphasis on other than environmental aspects of transport policy, but that then joined the discourse and thereby also joined the discourse coalition, at least, of environmental and sustainable transport policy. So we that was also something that we identified, that the discourse really changed and the preferences changed in this period as well, towards a more to feed, or to put it in the words of the question, to feed the environmental coalition in terms of size and power. I would agree with that.
Yes, we have then, I think, more general a question from Klaus Seib, and he wants to know, do you see a dynamic of newly emerging silos? But I don't know what Klaus exactly means with this. Of course, we all know these different shapes, and we all put it separately in one of these boxes. So yes, I think so. I know it's a metaphor. I don't know, Johanna, if you know this metaphor.
I would be glad if he could specify a little bit what is meant by silos, maybe.
I think, yeah, it means that we have these different these different topics, and we put it separated only in one stock, and this is problematic. The metaphor was used in other conditions, for example, communication and so on. But yes, so maybe I would think that these actors and actor networks here would be act too much separately, and so they are yes, they put too much only in one. They go only in one direction, and they do not interact maybe enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would say that there's not that much of a danger that this happens, because now the orientation towards environmental friendly transport, it was pluralized once, but then the other actors kind of joined this discourse, and I would say that there still is a lot of exchange among these actors, but it just has unified to a certain extent, which of course does not exclude the danger that some aspects might also be overseen because the actors originally promoting and advocating these aspects are now also following the environmentally friendly discourse.
Okay, so we have a comment from Neil Stockmann. He says, wants to say about the unstable preferences also feeds in the argument of the crisis in a more broader understanding as open junctions for individual transition. Yeah, maybe that is really the case. And then yes, we have this additional comment from Klaus Leibt with the silo metaphor. He would like to talk tomorrow about the programmatic silos in European sustainable urban transport policies, of course. So I think we will now understand what you mean, that every city, for example, is only thinks only about itself and their goals and their ambitions. Yeah, so I would then thank you very much for this. I think we are maybe just in time, maybe a little bit late. And so I think we can go on with the next presentation. And I would thank you very much again, Johanna and colleagues, for this really interesting presentation. And I'm really hopefully that there will be additional research, but I think I'm sure of that, because I think these questions of coalitions and also veto players and so on, is a very good starting point to go in detail and to see maybe these these very complex structures of these networks, and also these very important obstacles which are regarding in these transport policies of cities, but also regions. So thank you again very much, and I will then Beat, you will now start again.
Okay, thank you, and hello to Miranda. You are here in the picture now. I already mentioned that we are organizing this session and the next session tomorrow. And now we come to the third contribution for today by Anita Thaler from the University of Graz, and she will tell us something about the role of public acceptance in the process of transport transformation, Verkehrswende, and she will present the results of a choice experiment. Yeah, we are very curious. Anita, it's your turn.
Thank you. So my name is Anita Thaler, and I'm part of the doctoral program Climate Change at the University of Graz. And I'm actually presenting you some work in progress we're currently doing, and some results we're establishing the new work on. And the working title is Pushing Sustainable Mobility, a Choice Experiment on the Public Acceptance of So-Called Disruptive Policy Packages. I'm very happy to be here, and also it was super interesting to listen to the work of my colleagues. And I think maybe I can add something to that. So why do we need actually sustainable mobility in the first place? So I'm quite sure you're all aware of that the transport sector is one where we still have emission growth. And in Austria, we have this carbon neutrality goal for 2040, where, of course, it's clear that we need quite soon climate change mitigation measures for rapid transformation of the transport sector. But besides emission reductions, sustainable mobility would also hold, or would need to hold. Sorry, I think somebody is clicking the slides. Okay. Would not only hold emission reduction, but also other goals would go hand in hand, such as increased air quality. We would have less noise as one goal, higher safety in travel, higher health, or higher quality of life. And that means that we need far-reaching change to enable this transformation, and that means also a stronger focus on the demand side approaches. As Bannister summarizes in his sustainable mobility paradigm, there are 4 main strategies from a policy perspective how we can change travel. So we can reduce the need to travel in the form of less trips necessary. We can encourage a model shift from, for example, motorized individual transport towards more sustainable modes, just like non-motorized transport like bikes, or also public transport. Then we can reduce trip lengths, so to make things more accessible, which is especially relevant for urban areas. And then we can encourage greater efficiency in the transport system, which is often related to fuel efficiency, but also can incorporate other things, such like ICT increases, etc. And we already heard the role of policies in this whole transformation. That is really important, because it's very unlikely, especially in the really short time frame we have. We heard for Hessen for the 2025 goal of carbon neutrality. So we need here a focus on policy making, because it is quite unlikely that this will occur independently from a consumer side. So I brought with me some results of a study we did that was published in January this year in Transportation Research Part D, where you can just see a variety of different policies structured by the avoid, shift, improve model, so which is highly related to the Bannister concept. So you can rather avoid transport, shift it to other modes, or improve it in terms of efficiency. And then you can see on the y-axis different kinds of policies. So you have incentives, you have command and control, regulatory measures, and then you have more planning measures that are highly related to infrastructure changes. And there you can just see different groups of policies that are located in this matrix, and you can see that infrastructure and provision and spatial planning is in the planning sector more, or that you have alternative fuels more in the proof section. And then you have other things like commuter solutions, which is highly relevant right now in the corona situation, where we have also ongoing research on the increased share of home office and how we can use that for sustainable mobility. So just as a first overview of different policy options. But as you're probably also aware of, we're not talking about single policies when we're trying to incorporate sustainable mobility, but rather we talk about policy packages, because it's nearly impossible to have one policy that can incorporate all the things necessary, especially when it's not only about emission reduction, but also about other goals, and maybe also about the topic of justice we heard before. So this is one of the results of our last publication, where we came up with this balance between 2 parts that are very important when policy packages are discussed. And the first thing would be the disruptiveness. So we need a high level and rapid effectiveness of policies that are incorporated to ensure that we can reach these emission reduction goals, where we often talk about, but not only, but often about push measures. So things that are pushing people away from individual motorized transport towards other modes or other forms of activity. And this often happens via restrictions, via taxation. So about push measures. And then, of course, you have the other side of the balance, because you cannot only reduce transport alternatives, or you cannot only push people out of the cars, but do not have like another option for them available. So you have this other side that is dealing with implementability, where social acceptance, which is the major topic of our current work, but also other factors like costs involved in defining new alternatives are important for a policy package to be implementable. And there you have, of course, a lot of pull measures that are typically involved in this. So you try to pull people from the more motorized individual transport towards sustainable mobility modes by giving them attractive alternatives, by giving them incentives, by use awareness raising, etc. So these are is like kind of the baseline. And if you have a close look on the bottom, it's always about infrastructure and spatial planning. So this is kind of what we found in our research, that before you can talk about making major changes, making disruptive changes, trying to transform, there has to be some baseline on infrastructure and spatial planning in the go, so people have the possibility to change their behavior or to make it easier. So what's going on in our current work? We now deal with the question, we know we need push and pull measures, and we know that pull measures are the ones that are quite accepted, whereas push measures are always the ones that are not that well received within the public, within the general public. So the question is, if we package them in an effective way, can this increase the acceptability of potentially effective or disruptive policy measures? And then is also the question, which kind of pull measures are most publicly accepted? So are the differences, and do we have different choices in which kind of push measures we include? And also in the case of low acceptance, how could we increase this acceptance? And we have two main hypotheses involved, so that these push measures are more socially acceptable when we combine them with complementary pull measures into policy package, and also that there are differences based on the type of restriction and based on the previous work we did already. Also, we include additional hypotheses based on control variables. So we expect that car use, the number of kilometers traveled by car per year, has a negative influence on the public acceptance, whereas environmental awareness has a positive influence on public acceptance of push measures. So what did we do actually within a broader project, which is called Quality, and which deals with this transformation of the transport sector within Austria to enable the 2040 goal of carbon neutrality. We constructed 3 policy packages based on a stakeholder workshop, literature, reviews, and group discussions, which are basically quite similar in the way they incorporate different pull measures and incentives and offers, but they differ on the way they restrict transport. So you can see we have here a regulatory, a capacity, and an economic package, where the regulatory one would incorporate a ban on the new or first registration of cars with combustion engines, as well as a ban on the use of such cars, a reduction of public parking spaces, as well as in general car-free city centers. In contrast to that, the capacity package is for annual mileage cap for private cars per household, which basically means that you have a number of kilometers you can drive per year or per month, and also a reduction and redesign of street space in favor of more sustainable modes. And the economic package would increase a fuel price increase, congestion charging, and increasing in parking prices for cities. So those are the 3 main approaches, and this is complemented by a range of pull measures, just as I mentioned before, expansion of infrastructure for public and active transport, also expansion of e-mobility infrastructure, financial incentives, mobility education, school, etc. So the research design we followed was that we want to follow, and where we did some pre-steps already, is that we want to have an experimental group setting within an online survey in cooperation with a market research institute for the Austrian general public. And we will have 2 groups. one group, the group A, will get the information that pull and push measures that are presented within the survey are implemented together within a broader policy package, whereas the group B also gets presented pull and push measures, but they do not get this relevant information on policy packaging. So the focus is on the public acceptance on these policy measures. We ask for general acceptance scales for pull measures, and we look closer into the push measures because we think that this, of course, is the interesting part where it gets a bit tricky for public support, and we'll use choice models for comparing between the push measures. And as I already mentioned, we expect a higher acceptance for push measures when they are perceived to be within a policy package together with pull measures, where they also are receiving incentives and offers. And so there will be a comparison between groups. And we conducted already a number of pre-steps. So currently we are preparing the pre-test of the survey that will take place in the next weeks. We had to shift some of our steps because of the corona situation. As you may know, there was quite a long lockdown time in Austria, and as we incorporate also mode choice questions within the survey, it was a bit difficult to start before lockdowns are a bit lifted. So we did pre-steps. We tried to refine these different intensity levels for policies based on focus groups we did with participants in November 2020 in an online setting. And also we did already probing interviews for the survey to improve the questioning. And as I said, we currently prepare the pre-test and hope to start the real survey in about April 2021. And I just brought with me here an example of a choice set, so you have a better idea how it will look like for the push measures that are presented. So you always have two alternatives that are presented in such a setting, and you just ask people which combination they prefer, but also how they rate each of the policy packages to get a better understanding also about the relative strength of support or of not supporting these policy packages. Yeah, that was just a rough outline of the status quo. Here are some references, and it also includes the paper we published currently. And yeah, if you're interested, of course, have a look. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's enough time left for discussion, I think. And there I see already the first questions, but before I would take the opportunity to ask the first question, and it's more or less a fundamental question. Do you think that public acceptability is more or less a problem? Because the most successful public transport or transport transformation policies in the last years, they neglect public acceptance. For example, Paris. For example, Paris is, I think, the interesting case because the mayor, Madame Hulot, said she will introduce a completely new public transport and car-free policy in Paris, and she will do it. Even she will not be re-elected. She said that 1 or 1.5 years ago, and she was re-elected. She is re-elected now, but she introduced a completely radical policy without looking on public acceptance. So that's the question: is radical or disruptive policy of transformation of the transport sector of the city only possible if you neglect public acceptance?
Thank you. That's a very interesting point. I think, but it also has to do that a politician is willing to, not bet on getting re-elected. That's a bit of the problem, So a lot of politics is, built on the thing that people want to get re-elected, and then are having like this fear of low public acceptance. So of course, if we think about like transformative governance, and you have people like in Paris that are striving this forward, I think that's really interesting. But I think it's not like the majority.
It's the exception, yes.
Yeah, it's the exception. So I think you also have to be a bit careful with acceptance, because we have this difference between pre and post acceptance. So if we talk about very disruptive, new, transformative kind of policies that have not been here before, we often see that people have like a bit of struggles beforehand, because they cannot really imagine new things, and afterwards, if they are implemented, it gets better. So I agree with you that, of course, you want to get some picture of how the reaction will be, so you have no public outrage that would really like stop the implementation right away, because of course this could happen that you then cannot implement. But also I think, as you said, that you also have to be a bit that you have to step forward and also see that that public acceptance might increase anyways if it's implemented then. But I think it's quite difficult. You cannot see beforehand, and if you want to get something implemented, I think you cannot completely ignore it right away. So that's why I think it's good to have a look on it.
Okay, the first question from the audience regarding the push-pull balance. In which unit should you measure policies in order to specify to find the point where the scale is equal? Put differently, how do you weight push and pull policies, and why must the scale be equal?
Mm-hmm. So thank you for the question, Gracia. So I think it has to keep in balance a bit to be able to refer to the thing I just said, to be able to come into the implementation anyways, because otherwise it could happen if you just strive for the push measures and not think about like giving people something like an alternative. They may just seem, you take away my car from me, but for example in rural areas you don't have then an alternative to go to work. So that could be the problem. So you try to keep it in balance, but of course this is a metaphor, so you don't have to equally balance it per unit. So we did not do a quantitative analysis about this in the paper, but rather to deal with this image of, keep in mind that if you want to strive for something that is more disruptive, you have to keep people with you to be able to also have the alternative to change their behaviors. You have to give them something in return. So I think that's the basic thing. So it doesn't have to be completely equal, but you have to somehow try to keep the balance. I think that's the main info on that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next question from Miranda. She asked another chicken and egg question, and there's an argument regarding the experimental design that what is important are the choices made available by producers, and how are preferences shaped here?
Mm-hmm. I think that also relates a bit to that. Of course, you have to give them the opportunity to shape their preferences in a way. So I, for example, would often be happy to have the freedom to choose when I go to conferences to go by train solely, within Europe. For example, if I would have come to the Energy Futures conference to go solely by train. But of course, I have also to have the possibility from the university, for example, to not fly, because flying is like the shorter, the cheaper way. So I agree with you that it's not only about my preferences, but also about the possibility to live these preferences. And I think the experimental design will be quite interesting in how people how people's preferences are shaped based on communication, because we're in this two group comparison, we compare whether whether we communicate it as a policy package or whether not. And I think, yeah, that will be quite interesting. And I hope this somehow answered your question, or I got you right.
Yeah, there's another question from Miranda. She asked where the transformative ideas, the new ideas, come from in your design. Where do you get these new ideas?
Mm-hmm.
So, who formulated?
Yeah, thank you. So we in the paper we referred to, we of course made an extensive literature review. So it's a bit of research and researchers, but also we looked at different policy papers. So it was a bit of what is already on the table, what is discussed, what is planned for like in some future plans for cities and for also even countries. And then we talked with different public officials and also on a national and also on a local level, and did some stakeholder workshops on that. So we tried to incorporate different points of views, but it was more on this, interest groups, researchers, politicians, etc. And now, because it was not really with the general public, we really want to, try to have this mirrored by what is the public thinking about this, because sometimes expectations and reality of the two are not always met, as we know. Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's another question from Gracia. I didn't really understand. The question is regarding the redesign of streets for active transport modes. It's a classical push and pull measure. Mm-hmm. Also, it's on the lower part. Can you explain? I did not really understand.
Yeah, maybe I think it's just about the metrics.
Okay, yes, yeah.
It's not about the metrics. Next slide. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's about this capacity reduction and redesign of street space. Yes. Okay. And you ask me. Okay, and you ask why it's more why we defined it as a push measure, although it can also be understood as a pull measure. Yes, exactly. So I totally agree with you. Sometimes this difference between push and pull are not completely strict. We try to simplify it. You frame it twice. Yeah, so it's a push measure for like the individual motorized transport, because you take away space from them, but also at the same time it can work as a pull measure for other modes. So that's why maybe I was not completely clear or was not completely straightforward in the way I put it on the slides. But it's, as you're completely right here. It's a bit of it can be both. It's both push and pull, whether you see it from this or that perspective.
Okay. I think that's more or less a general point, because a lot of measures can be both.
Exactly. That's a really valid point.
Okay, Juliana Haus asks, do you see a connection between your experimental approach and real-world laboratory settings? And could your results be used as a pre-test for the selection of a fruitful measure mix in a real setting?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's also very interesting. So I think like this urban labs that are discussed a lot right now, where you can really try out something also to increase pre-acceptance. I think it's a really good idea, and I think it would be super interesting to see what our results bring there, and whether based on those you could go for such a real life lab. So that's a really interesting input there. I'm there with you. Thank you. So.
Okay, there's a comment from Garcia. So you need to look who the people are and how they perceive part of your policy mixes. Yes, that's
exactly.
It's more a push or pull factor. Yes. Okay. And Klaus Seibt is asking, did you assess if your measures are in line with legal or constitutional frames in Austria in the European Commission?
Thank you. So within this project, I refer to this quality project. There is also like one work package dedicated to this legal feasibility of things, where they try to define or research on what is possible, what is not possible, what would have to change. But we in this public acceptance paper we're trying to make, we're not focusing really on the legal feasibility because they work on it in parallel. But of course, the idea is then in the whole project to, kind of combine all the strengths and see whether you have like a conflict of interest there between what is legally possible at the moment and what would be like really disruptive or what would be interesting from an emission reduction. Yeah, the millage cap is the one, you're completely right, Klaus, which is one of the, I can just refer to what my colleagues mentioned already in the discussions, but it's one of the most tricky ones. Also, how you define or differ between different households and also individuals and different residential locations. Yeah.
Okay, I take the opportunity to break up here because we have left nearly 20 minutes, so we can come. Thank you very much. We come
Thank you.
to the fourth contribution, and I give over to Jörg.
Yes, yeah. Thank you also very much for this very interesting insights. And now we will come, as I see, last but not least, I think, to the to our final presentation today, and it is so the whole contribution is by Rebecca Lea Freudel and Juliane Haus from Berlin, from the Berlin Social Science Center, and Holger Straßheim, who will now present this contribution from Bielefeld University. The topic of this presentation now is mobility at the nexus, expert networks between mobility, climate, energy, and consumer policy. And as you will see in the following, the presentation is about communicating across policy areas and the inclusion and exclusion of stakeholder groups. So it is, in my opinion, a very exciting field of research at the end of this panel now. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, Holger, and I would like to ask you to start it now.
Great. Yeah, many thanks for the kind words, Jörg, and also for the invitation, Bert and Jörg, to this panel, also on behalf of my colleagues, Juliane Haus and Rebecca Lea Freudel. It would be great to also see the presentation here. If you could just open it. Yeah, I'm presenting some selected results from a research project that was funded by the Mercator Foundation. That is actually a cooperation between the Social Science Research Center, the BZB, and the University of Bielefeld. And that focuses on the nexus, the interlinkage between different policy areas, climate, consumption, and mobility, of course. I think I'm having a problem with the slides. Jörg, could you please open the slides so that everyone can see them?
I can do that, but not my job, and I'm not so familiar with the system. So I would like to ask, of course, the others, Wert and our...
Jörg, I can,
yes, and
if I may
Aisha.
just interrupt, you need the presentation in the content library. I don't know if you've uploaded it before into the content library. Did someone do that?
Yeah,
okay,
no, of
so
course,
you can,
of course.
You can just click on the content library on your left-hand side and
Yeah, I
just
did.
choose the presentation, double-click on it, and select show. Then it has to show here in the audience.
I opened the content library, but there is no presentation at the moment.
Okay, so it's not
can
uploaded.
also see no presentation.
So it's not uploaded yet.
Okay. It has been uploaded, and I think we checked together. So it's gone at the moment.
Okay, are you able to upload it right now? Do you have it on your?
I try it also.
Perfect.
Would be great.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm the second presenter, but I can see it. Shall I click on it?
Yeah, perfect. If you see, perfect.
That's really weird.
Yeah, perfect.
There we are. Great.
So you've uploaded it.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Okay, but okay, that was our question in the
I think
run up to the panel.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just there an hour ago, but
okay, but now you can click in the
Perfect.
Yeah, works perfectly well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry for the interruption. Okay. Yeah, the project focuses on the nexus between mobility, climate, energy, and consumer policy. The area, the sphere, so to speak, where policy domains intersect, where they are interlinked. Please allow me to give you a brief introduction into the research design, and then my colleague Rebecca Lea-Freudel will present some empirical results to you on the capability of actors at this nexus between the policy areas to network and to communicate across these policy areas, and also on the inclusion and exclusion of stakeholder groups, something we called nexus inclusivity. The nexus, the area where, for example, consumer behavior also shapes energy consumption, and so the construction of smart energy grids, is a complex area. We have complex interdependencies. We have institutional silos. Klaus Seibt mentioned this. And as we are going to see, not only institutional, but also structural silos. There are controversies about solutions, but also sometimes about the interpretation of problems. And we have very diverse stakeholders. So when we started this project, we had a core assumption that there should be arrangements that are already coordinating between different policy areas, that are already producing expert knowledge on how to interlink, how to coordinate these different tasks. And it turned out that there are indeed such arrangements that we are calling policy expert arrangements, more than 80 in Germany. And we did what most of social scientists would do. We developed a typology of these different arrangements, which also is going to give you a better idea of what we are talking about. It has actually two dimensions. The one is the dimension of actor involvement. Are these arrangements involving many actors, or are they actually closed? Do they have their own silo logic, so to speak? And on the other hand, in the epistemic dimension, are they open to different problem definitions, or are the problems also already defined? And we have very open arrangements, such as the governance trialogues on mobility or energy, organized by the Viadrina, for example. And we have also very closed arrangements focusing on very specific problems in a group of specialists, such as monitorings and simulations, and in between different arrangements, policy labs and experimental spaces just mentioned by the colleague Juliane Haus, but also participatory foresights and assessments. We looked in this project at these different arrangements and asked ourselves, how are they connected at the nexus? We built a data set that includes data from 2013 to 2017, is based on documents, meeting minutes, also interviews, and that has become very large, and it shows how these different arrangements that I was talking about are connected by their members, individuals and organizations, more than 20,000 at the moment in our data set, and how they are actually connecting these different organizations and individuals. We used a mixed methods design, qualitative, interpretive methods, but also a quantitative, classical, you could say, social network analysis, looking at basic structural network measures such as centrality, but also at other network statistics on the different links and on the different actors to get a better understanding on the cross policy area networks, and also on the inclusivity, and to basically get an idea on what Miranda Schroers has just mentioned. Where do transformative ideas come from? And when do we find silos that are really close to these ideas? And now I would like to ask Rebecca to continue with some of the results.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Holger. Yeah. So just to give you an impression of this diverse landscape of policy expert arrangements at the nexus between mobility policy and its neighboring policy areas, we brought you here today this slide with the visual network map of the entire network. Here you can see all German mobility, energy, climate and consumer policy expert arrangements in the studied time period from 2013 to 2017. So for now, I do not want to go too much into the detail of this network map. However, I would like to point out two aspects. First, we see here a very high network density, which is why it is very difficult to recognize some form of pattern here. Nevertheless, at the edge of the network, you can see some of the most central policy expert arrangements in the overall network, which are represented here by those nodes that are enlarged compared to other nodes. These policy expert arrangements are connected to one another via members, organizations which are members, or organizations which are active participants in the arrangements. And second, what we can immediately see here is that the most central policy expert arrangements are surrounded by a large amount of black lines, which stands in our visualization for business. while the less central policy expert arrangements in the bottom left hand corner are surrounded by green lines, which is in our operationalization stands for civil society. So what I would do in the following is to zoom in, so to say, on two specific aspects of this network that relate to what we have called Nexus capability, Holger just mentioned, and Nexus inclusivity. Yeah, so let me begin with Nexus capability. That is the capability to communicate across different policy areas. And as you might know, theories of policy learning assume that Nexus capabilities are a kind of necessary prerequisite to cope with highly complex knowledge problems, such as mobility and energy transition, or the sector coupling Holger mentioned in his introduction. And indeed, many of the expert arrangements in the network, in our network, claim to produce knowledge and solutions that address policy interdependencies. Yet when zooming into the core of the network, which is made up of particularly influential actors and of knowledge brokers, strong knowledge brokers, we find a rather different picture. So here the bar charts you can see here in this slide represent the proportionate policy area related competence profiles of all organizations within the network core within a specific policy area. So mobility policy you see here framed in red by the red box. Based on this overview, we can argue that the Nexus capability of mobility policy expert arrangements of the network and mobility policy is only weakly developed. Mobility expert arrangements integrate competencies in climate policy and in consumer policy only to a very low degree, while they have comparatively stronger competencies in energy policy, but round about 2/3 of the organizations participating in the mobility network have only competences in mobility policy. Yeah, the second result we want to present to you is relates to Nexus inclusivity. So in our definition, quite simple, Nexus inclusivity relates to the heterogeneity of the different societal stakeholder groups that are represented in a specific policy expert arrangement. So to which percentage are actors from science, from public policy and administration, from business, and from civil society represented then in the mobility network, which is our interest today, in the core of this mobility network. So here in this bar chart, you can see the clear dominance of politics and industry actors, which amount, the dominance of policy actors, which amount around 30%, and business actors, which amount more than 40%. The network, in the network core, civil society is really marginalized. Only 4% of the organizations in the network core are civil society actors. Coming to the end, to the conclusion of our talk, we can make three main conclusions. First, the differentiated landscape of policy policy expert arrangements in mobility policy is shaped by different logics of expertise. Holger mentioned as represented in our typology. But what all of these expert arrangements have in common is a claim to interdependent problem solving and participatory knowledge production. Yet, as our analysis has shown, the expert network in mobility policy integrates competencies from energy, climate, and consumer policy only to a low degree. And third, the nexus, the network core is dominated by actors from business as well as by actors from public policy and administration. Civil society here is marginalized. It is in the shadow. Civil society is in the shadow of state and business. And yeah, so one can argue that these findings illustrate the need for moving beyond this kind of symbolic participation towards opening up to civil society and other policy areas. And also in the light of the dominance of state and business actors, one could moreover argue that there's also a need of moving beyond this kind of invited participation towards more self-organized participation that could then challenge these closed shop arrangements. And okay, sorry, I was just by this push message disturbed. So yeah, and finally, on a more theoretical level, these findings show us that that the co-production of expertise between science, politics, and society, which is also, as you all know, very extremely fashionable these times in discourses of mobility transition, energy transition, does not level authority and power relations. So the precise way in which the co-production of expertise within these kinds of allegedly hybrid but closed expert networks really changes power and authority relations needs to be the subject of more and further research. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and we are looking forward to your comments. Yeah.
Yes, so thank you very much for this very interesting insights. I think we have to be very quick with our round now with the questions and answers. So I will just start with the first comments and questions from Miranda. She says, well, do you see any differences over the time? I guess you only have a short time framework, but I'm wondering if civil society groups may be getting more integrated. And she continues in saying, I'm wondering because of growing role of the bottom-up grassroots movements. And she also says your work does help to understand why the transport area has been one of the slowest to transform. Yes, maybe this is, I can say this is right, because maybe it's obvious. Yes, so what could you answer to this?
Maybe I can just start. Yeah, with a short remark, yes, you are right. This is really, I mean, we don't have a large time frame here, yeah, it's on a very skeptical note. One has to say that indeed there is a large participation also of civil society groups and grassroots movements. But if you use the network analytics to focus on the core, on those who are, you know, interacting the most, who are networking the most, then you will find that all these groups, not all, but most of them disappear. And that's what we did. We looked at the core. This may change over time. It would be interesting to follow this up. But at the moment, yeah, it leaves you very skeptical about the capability of the transport sector to really change and internalize new ideas. Rebecca, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. Grassroots civil society actors are at the edge, not at the edge, but in the periphery of the network. But the more you move on to the core, they disappear. However, what is true also for the entire network, so including core and periphery, is that even the group of civil society actors is very dominated by classical German corporatist logic. So it's the Dachverband Verbraucherzentrale, so the largest association of consumer policy, which is half financed by the state. What is very funny, the ADAC, the German car mobile club, which is very pro car mobility, is the only representative, civil society representative who is left in the network core. So to give you a bit more qualitative feeling what is behind these data. So yeah.
So Miranda, do you have something to add, or?
I think what you said was very interesting. Your work's very interesting. What I was wondering, and I presume your work is actually still not able to show if there's any changes over time in the actors in the core. So maybe it's a suggestion that in 5 years' time, you do the study again, because then you have some nice papers to compare time periods and to see if there's any shifts in who the actors are and who's at the core. My guess is the shifts won't be large, but maybe there's a little bit of a shift.
Yeah, that would be so interesting. And I would say we are very open to this suggestion. Definitely. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I would like to integrate the next question from Martin Herzig. He wants to know, the transport policy field is strongly segmented by mode of transport and also expressed by almost no associations dealing with all modes of transport. Also, did you check the differences regarding the different modes of transport? For example, are the segments that are more or less, so are these segments more or less open?
Yeah, this is also something which we could do with our data, coding for the specific mode of transport. But as you might remember, Holger mentioned that there are over 20,000 concerning the entire network, 20,000 participants or organizations in the network. And in the core, also a large number still. This would be also another research project, but yeah, very interesting way to go forward. Thank you.
Okay, so I can see here one last question from Klaus, and he wants to know. He says, in the Austrian Ministry of Transport, Innovation and Technology, so this ministry, it was even difficult to gain a nexus between the transport-related research and the innovation section. So the policy program owner for sustainable mobility issues and the transportation section, so the infrastructure and regulatory issues. So I think he sees their difference, and I think, or I assume that he wants to know if you could agree to this, or if you underline this.
Yeah, it's hard to say. You are referring to the Austrian Ministry of Transport, to the inner connections. For me, that would be my spontaneous answer. It is just another example of those silos, structural, institutional, and it would be another take on all these data we have to just do research on the different types of structural and institutional silos. And we could do that. I think probably not within the ministry, but across different organizations and also expert arrangements at the nexus. Rebecca, would you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah,
but
okay.
It's always up to further funding, isn't it?
So,
okay, everyone wants to listen to Sheila Jasanoff, I guess.
To the next,
understandably,
section. Yes, maybe my last words would be, as you maybe know, I have made some research on participation within the energy transition, not regarding to the transport system. This is also, of course, energy-based. So, in my own view and my insights, I could see that participation, what maybe is more present in the other energy transition, we can see that this results then in other problems, as you know, for example, something like an overload of the governance of the whole energy transition and the multi-level governance and so on, and the problems to make a good coordination of this and to integrate all these included actors and ambitions and so on. And so